Hello, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's begin. Get comfortable and relax. I started working as a park ranger in late summer of 2013, right after my 29th birthday. I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship and was desperate to clear my head, maybe find a little solitude. I'd been living in Boise, bouncing between temp jobs and a failing attempt to get into wildlife biology. I'd applied for a seasonal ranger position in Montana, thinking I wouldn't even get a call back. But 3 weeks later, I was loading a beat-up Honda with everything I owned and driving north. The Bitterroot Range has always had this way of feeling older than it is. The mountains aren't the sharp, snow-capped types you see on postcards. They're forested, broad, quiet. People who've lived out there long enough say things feel too still sometimes. I didn't really understand what they meant until a couple of months in. The ranger station where I was posted wasn't much more than a shed with a generator and a cot in the back. It sat up a few miles past the main trailheads and acted as a midway point for longer hikes. My job was simple: maintain trails, track wildlife activity, log foot traffic, and monitor weather equipment. I rotated weeks between that outpost and the main cabin, a bigger place, further up the ridge, tucked deep in a pocket of old pine. That cabin had been built sometime in the late 60s, updated with solar panels in the early 2000s, but still pretty bare bones. One bedroom, a propane stove, an old hand pump for water, and no cell service. It was late September when I was assigned a 10-day stint up at that ridge cabin. My supervisor, a guy named Thomas who'd been doing the job longer than I'd been alive, warned me that weather could turn quickly that time of year. I didn't think much of it, just packed extra food, my cold weather gear, and my small .308 rifle in case I ran into anything too curious. The hike up was long, about 12 miles, but quiet. No tourists that far out, and the trees were just beginning to drop their leaves. I reached the cabin by late afternoon. It sat like a square of gray shadow in a sea of green. The boards creaked as I stepped up onto the porch. The air was thin and sharp with that distinct pine-heavy scent. I dropped my pack just inside the doorway and took a minute to breathe it all in. The first 3 days passed without anything strange. I woke with the sun, took long walks down the boundary lines, and logged elk tracks, scat piles, and snapped branches. One morning, I found a pile of bones, picked clean, too clean for scavengers, but I figured maybe a cougar had come through and dragged off the meat. Still, it seemed fast. The ribs were bleached, almost white. I noted it and moved on. By the fourth night, the wind had picked up and temperatures dropped fast. I had layered up, lit the propane heater, and was reading one of the old paperbacks left behind by another ranger when I heard a faint tapping. I paused, listening. It was soft, barely there, and came in irregular spurts like something brushing against the wood panels outside. I figured it was a branch in the wind or maybe snowmelt dripping from the roof, but the sound didn't go away. I waited a few minutes, then stood and pulled on my boots. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. Nothing. The wind pushed through the trees like a soft whisper, but the area around the cabin was clear. No fallen branches. I walked the perimeter twice, sweeping the beam of my light in every direction. Still nothing. I went back in, shook off the chill, and tried not to think too much of it. The next night, it happened again. Same sound, same faint taps against the outer wall, this time near the window. The glass was old, a little foggy, but I could see nothing on the other side. I stepped out again, flashlight in hand, and circled the cabin. No tracks, no animals, no falling branches. Just me and the trees and the cold. On the 6th day, I found something out on the north trail that made my stomach knot. A pile of stones. Not unusual in itself, except they were arranged in a perfect spiral. maybe 5 feet wide, with a freshly gutted rabbit at the center. Its insides were missing, not torn out like by a predator, but gone clean, like someone had cut it with a blade. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't have a radio up there, and my only satellite link was back in my pack inside the cabin. A cheap emergency beacon we were only supposed to use for injury or fire. I took a photo of the spiral with my camera, backed away slowly, and went straight back to the cabin. I locked the door, even though I knew locks didn't matter much out there. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I didn't leave the cabin. I sat on the cot with my rifle across my lap and stared at the window until my eyes burned. The trees outside swayed gently, but nothing moved. No birds, no squirrels, just an oppressive silence. That night, I heard footsteps, not the scurrying of an animal, not the wind shifting a tree. These were slow, deliberate steps crunching down onto frost-covered leaves. I sat frozen, my breath shallow. The steps circled the cabin once, twice. Then silence. I didn't move until the sun came up. The moment daylight hit, I grabbed my rifle and pack and went to check around the cabin. I found tracks, human tracks, barefoot. I followed them out past the tree line until they vanished into a slope of hard rock. I didn't feel brave enough to keep going. My skin crawled. I could feel eyes on me, though. There was no sound. Back inside the cabin, I checked the emergency beacon. Still functioning. I held my hand over the button but didn't press it. Something in my head told me this wasn't an emergency. Not yet. Just fear playing tricks. That afternoon, I checked the rabbit spiral again. It was gone. The rocks had been scattered, not kicked, just picked apart, piece by piece. The blood was still in the dirt. I made it back to the cabin just as a light snow started falling. My boots were soaked. My gloves were damp. I sat near the heater trying to get warm. My eyes kept drifting to the window where fog collected in the corners of the glass. As darkness set in, I could almost swear I saw something beyond the tree line, a shape, not moving, just standing, watching. That night, the tapping came again. This time it was at the back of the cabin, slow, deliberate, almost like fingers dragging along the wood. I didn't check. I sat in the dark, holding the rifle tight, breathing through my nose so I wouldn't make noise. My ears strained for every creak, every shift of wood. And then, without warning, the tapping stopped, and the door handle creaked. Just a little. Just enough to let me know someone or something had tried it. The door held. I hadn't just locked it. I had wedged a chair under the knob. Still, I sat unmoving until dawn broke on the final day before I was scheduled to head back down the ridge. I packed everything before the sun even rose. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee. I just threw everything into my bag, slung the rifle, and left. I should have headed straight down the trail, but something made me go the long way, past the old dry creek bed and through a more open part of the woods. It added another hour to my hike, but I needed to avoid the spot where I'd seen the rabbit spiral. As I moved downhill, I found more signs, small ones. A notch in a tree shaped like a symbol I didn't recognize. Another gutted animal, this time a squirrel, nailed through both paws to a stump, with twigs arranged around it like a crude crown. I didn't stop. I didn't take photos. I just moved faster. By the time I reached the base trailhead, I was shaking. Not from the cold, but something deeper, something that had wormed its way into my gut over the last several nights. When I finally reached the ranger station, Thomas was there. He took one look at me and frowned. He asked if everything had gone smoothly. I just nodded. I didn't mention the footsteps or the rabbit or the gutted squirrel. I told him I'd had some trouble sleeping, maybe a touch of the flu. I took a hot shower, packed my things, and left for Boise that same day. I never went back. A few months later, I got a letter forwarded from the Montana Parks Department. They were closing that ridge cabin for maintenance after another ranger reported signs of vandalism. He'd found another spiral of rocks, another dead animal. I don't know who left them or why, but I do know this. It wasn't some harmless prank. Whoever or whatever was out there They knew I was alone. They knew I was isolated, and they wanted me to know they were close. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd opened the door that night, but I never will, and I never will go back. It was in the fall of 2013 when I decided to spend a few weeks off the grid. I was 34 at the time and working as a freelance contractor in construction. Jobs had slowed down after the summer, and I was in one of those slumps where everything felt off. I wasn't depressed exactly, but I was tired. Tired of the city noise, tired of people, tired of going to bed with my phone screen lighting up my face. I needed to be alone. Completely alone. I remembered this old property that had belonged to my great-uncle Paul, a small cabin way out in the woods near Grayson, Kentucky. I'd only been there once when I was a teenager, and the only thing I remembered clearly was how isolated it was. You had to drive through several miles of unmarked gravel roads, pass a broken wooden fence, and then cross a field that used to be a church graveyard, though the church itself had burned down decades before. The headstones were still there, most of them tilted or broken. My Uncle Paul had kept the land out of some kind of weird loyalty to the church, but no one visited anymore. He died in 2001, and the property sat untouched. Since then, when I called the county office, they confirmed that the land title was technically in my dad's name. He didn't care what I did with it. So I packed up some supplies: non-perishable food, basic tools, tarps, 2 flashlights, an axe, batteries, a camp stove, and a .38 revolver I hadn't touched in years. Figured I might need it out there. The place was surrounded by woods, and the last time I'd gone hunting with my uncle, we saw coyotes and a couple of black bears deeper in the hills. I left Louisville around 10 in the morning. By the time I got to Grayson, the sun was already dipping low. From the gas station at the edge of town, I took back roads for nearly an hour, dodging potholes and fallen branches. I wasn't even sure if the gravel path leading to the cabin would still be there, but when I spotted the rusted road sign that simply read Church Bend, I knew I was close. I slowed the truck to a crawl and followed the winding trail through woods that seemed thicker than I remembered. The gravel road narrowed until branches scraped the sides of the truck, and just when I started to wonder if I'd gone the wrong way, the trees opened up. I saw the old field ahead. Even from the truck, I spotted broken stones sticking out of the overgrown grass like crooked teeth. I parked near the fence and got out. The air was sharp and cold, smelled like pine needles and damp soil. I hadn't seen another house for over 40 minutes, and there was no cell reception here. It was perfect. The cabin was still there, tucked into a small patch of trees behind the graveyard. From the outside, it looked surprisingly intact. The door sagged a little, and some of the shutters hung loose, but the roof looked solid and the chimney was still standing. I walked around it once, checking for signs of animals or squatters, but saw nothing. Just leaves, spiderwebs, and a couple of deer prints in the soft dirt. Inside, the air was dry and stale. Dust covered every surface. Old furniture was still there. Paul's recliner, a table with a broken leg, a bookshelf with warped paperbacks. I set up my cot near the fireplace and cracked a couple of windows to air the place out. That first night was uneventful. I made some beans on the camp stove, read a little by lantern light, then bundled up and went to sleep. It was cold, but the silence was exactly what I needed. No cars, no texts, just the sound of wind moving through the trees. I woke early the next morning and took a walk around the property. The graveyard stretched longer than I remembered, maybe 30 or 40 headstones in total, most of them unmarked or worn smooth by weather. I couldn't find any fresh graves, nothing newer than 1968. The woods on the far side of the field looked thick and untouched. I followed a deer trail into them for maybe half a mile, then turned back before I got too deep. That afternoon, I chopped some wood, swept the cabin, and reinforced one of the shutters that had nearly fallen off. I tried not to think too hard about the graveyard. I'd grown up around farmland and old barns. It wasn't that weird for land to have a cemetery nearby, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was because it had no fence, just sunken stones scattered across a field like forgotten debris. It was on the third night that I noticed something strange. I'd gone to bed early, bundled up tight in my sleeping bag. I didn't have a fire going, didn't want to waste wood, yet around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to piss. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped outside. The moon was bright enough that I barely needed the light. The air had that deep, dead quiet that only comes in the middle of nowhere. I walked a few yards from the porch, did my business near the tree line, and turned to head back. That's when I saw it. A small shape, maybe 5 feet tall, standing at the edge of the graveyard near the far row of headstones. I froze. I aimed the flashlight toward it, but it was gone. Nothing there, just cold air and grass. I stood there for a minute, listening. No sound, not even crickets. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a kid-sized stump. I went back inside and locked the door. The next day, I walked to that part of the graveyard and looked around. Nothing unusual, no footprints, no broken branches. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. My brain playing tricks in the dark. Still, I started sleeping with the revolver next to the cot. By the end of the first week, I'd fallen into a routine. Chop wood, walk the trails, cook simple meals. I'd even started journaling again, something I hadn't done in years. It helped keep me grounded. But things started happening. Small things. One morning, I found the front door wide open. I was sure I'd locked it before bed. The air inside was freezing. Nothing was stolen, but a pile of pine needles had blown in across the floor as if the door had been open all night. A few days later, I spotted something near the graveyard again. Not a shape. This time something smaller. I found a sock, a child's sock, half buried in the dirt near one of the older graves. It was blue with a faded stripe. No reason it should be there. There were no houses for miles, no roads, no campsites. I picked it up with a stick, tossed it into the trees, and walked back to the cabin with a tight knot in my stomach. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and stacked firewood inside. The next morning, there were boot prints in the frost outside, adult-sized, deep, leading from the trees to the graveyard, then back into the woods. I didn't sleep well after that. Each night, I thought I heard faint sounds outside, not animals. Those I could recognize. These were slow footsteps, branches cracking. One night, I swore I heard breathing outside the window, steady and slow, like someone standing inches away. But whenever I looked, there was nothing. I told myself it was wildlife, maybe hunters passing through. I considered leaving, but part of me refused. I didn't want to give in to fear. I'd come here for silence and space. I couldn't crawl back to the city after one weird week in the woods. Then it got worse. On the 12th night, I woke to find the door open again. The chair I'd used to block it was tipped over. The firewood I'd stacked inside was scattered across the floor. My cot had been moved, shifted several feet, not by accident. It looked deliberate. The revolver was still under the pillow. Nothing was missing, but someone had been inside. I stepped outside into the freezing dark, flashlight in hand, revolver in the other. I circled the cabin, heart pounding. There were no fresh tracks, but the ground was hard with frost. I walked to the graveyard and stood there, scanning the stones. That's when I noticed the shovel. It was leaning against one of the graves, old and rusted, but it hadn't been there before. I checked the grave. The soil had been disturbed, not dug up fully, but someone had started to, maybe a foot down. I stood there for a long time, staring into the shallow hole. The wind picked up. I turned and went back to the cabin, bolting the door shut behind me. The next morning, I packed everything. I didn't care if I looked crazy. I wasn't staying another night. By mid-afternoon, I was driving back down the gravel road, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. When I got to the next town, I found a motel and stayed there. A few days later, I went back with the sheriff from Grayson and 2 deputies. I told them what I'd seen, left out the parts they wouldn't believe. We found the grave half dug, the shovel still there. They didn't find any prints or signs of people, but they took it seriously enough to file a report. I never went back after that. Later, I learned from a local that there had been a drifter, a man in his 40s, arrested years ago for squatting in abandoned hunting cabins. He'd vanished in the early 2000s. Rumors said he was dangerous, maybe schizophrenic. Lived off animals and whatever food he could find. I don't know if it was him. I don't know who was out there with me. All I know is that someone was living in those woods, someone who didn't want me there, and they watched me every night from the edge of the graveyard. I sold the property a year later. Some guy bought it cheap, probably planning to tear the cabin down and build something new. I never told him about the shovel or the sock or the breathing outside the windows, but I still think about it, especially when I wake in the middle of the night and feel like someone is standing outside, watching, waiting. I was 27 when I decided to spend a month at my grandfather's old farm cabin deep in the heart of northern Wisconsin. It was 1998, late spring, just before the full burst of summer. The farm had been in my family for 3 generations, but I never really knew it well. My grandfather passed away a few years back, and since then the land sat mostly untouched. I wanted to get away from the city noise, the constant buzz of work and people, and figure some things out. This place felt like the last real quiet spot I could find. The cabin was simple, built with rough-cut pine logs, weathered by time and storms. The roof sagged a little, and the porch creaked when the wind hit just right. The farm was isolated about 5 miles from the nearest road, with thick woods on one side and open fields stretching out on the other. The dirt driveway was overgrown with grass, and the fields were dotted with wildflowers and scattered patches of tall grass that swayed gently in the wind. A slow creek meandered through the property, giving the farm its name, Willow Creek. I arrived in the early afternoon, driving my old pickup through the winding dirt road that led to the farm. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. I parked next to the cabin and stepped out, taking in the silence. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the world has paused. The only sounds were distant bird calls and the soft rush of the creek. The cabin's door was unlocked, the lock rusty from disuse. Inside, dust coated every surface, and the wooden floorboards creaked underfoot. The windows were grimy, letting in soft, muted light. The furniture was old and simple. A rickety wooden table, a couple of chairs, a small bed covered with a patchwork quilt, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a worn metal stove in the corner for cooking and a basin for washing. I set down my bags and took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. That first evening, I gathered some firewood from the shed behind the cabin. The shed was falling apart, but it still held dry logs stacked in neat piles. The farm's fields began to darken as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long and thin across the land. I built a fire in the fireplace and sat close, warming my hands. The cabin felt cold and empty, the walls echoing with quiet creaks and groans. I tried to settle in, unpacking the few things I had brought: clothes, a notebook, some canned food, and a flashlight. The nights were colder than I expected, and the silence pressed down harder once darkness fully settled. I found myself listening to every little noise: the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs outside, the distant hoot of an owl. There was a weight in the stillness, like the farm held its breath. Over the next few days, I explored the property, clearing weeds from the garden patch, fixing the fence where the wire had broken, and checking the creek for fresh water. I started keeping a small journal, writing down thoughts and observations, though sometimes I couldn't find the words. The farm was beautiful, but lonely in a way that got under your skin. On the third night, things began to feel off. I woke up just after midnight to a faint sound outside the cabin. It was soft at first, like footsteps on dry leaves, but slow and deliberate. I stayed still, my heart pounding, staring into the dark window. The moon was just a sliver, casting pale light on the yard. The noise stopped, then started again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and moved quietly to the door, peering outside. The beam cut through the dark and had catching glimpses of the overgrown garden and the tall grass by the creek. Nothing moved. I stayed out there for a while, shining the light, but only the wind and the creaking trees responded. Eventually, I went back inside, locking the door and sliding the bolt home. The next day, I found the garden gate pushed open. The wire fence was bent outward in one spot. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog, but something didn't feel right. I spent the day on edge, checking the perimeter and repairing the fence again, this time more carefully. The feeling of being watched crept in, even when I was alone in the bright daylight. That night, the footsteps came again, but this time they were louder, and I heard a faint scraping noise near the back of the cabin. I stayed awake for hours, flashlight in hand, staring out the window. The farm felt alive in a way that wasn't natural, like it was hiding something. My nerves were tight, and sleep was impossible. Over the next week, the strange noises grew more frequent and bolder. Doors that I was sure I had closed were found slightly ajar in the mornings. My tools, left on the porch, were sometimes moved. Footprints appeared in the soft earth near the creek, too large for any normal animal, but oddly shaped like someone had been wearing heavy boots. I told myself it was probably a prank by some locals, though I hadn't seen a single soul in days. One afternoon, while clearing brush near the creek, I found a crude fire pit with charred wood and ashes. Nearby, I spotted broken glass bottles and some scraps of torn fabric. It looked like someone had camped close by recently, but the spot was deep in the woods, not visible from the cabin. The idea that someone had been watching me, hiding just out of sight, made my skin crawl. I took extra care locking the cabin and started carrying a hunting knife I found in an old drawer. I didn't want to admit to myself how scared I was getting, but the unease was growing like a weight in my chest. I tried to focus on the tasks, fixing the fence, checking the creek, chopping firewood, but every shadow seemed alive, every rustle a threat. On the 12th night, the quiet shattered. I was lying in bed, the cabin dark except for the flickering firelight in the fireplace. Suddenly, a loud crash came from outside, something heavy hitting the side of the cabin. I bolted upright, heart hammering, then silence. I waited, listening hard. After a few minutes, I grabbed the flashlight and went to the door. The porch was empty, but the gate at the end of the driveway was swinging wildly in the wind. I stepped outside, the beam of the flashlight sweeping across the yard. Nothing moved, but footprints were pressed into the dirt right under the porch steps. They were large, irregular, and fresh. My mind raced. Someone had been there just moments before. I checked every window, then locked myself inside again. That night, I barely slept, clutching the knife and staring into the dark corners of the cabin. The next morning, I made a plan. I packed my bags and was ready to leave. But before I could start the truck, I noticed something strange near the barn. The side door was open. I was sure I had closed it tightly the day before. Inside, the tools were scattered. The old tractor covered in scratches. I felt a surge of anger and fear. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through. They were looking for something. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check the woods around the farm, trying to spot signs of whoever had been sneaking around. As I walked the tree line, I found more signs. Footprints leading deeper into the forest, broken branches and a rough path worn through the underbrush. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The thought of confronting a stranger in the middle of nowhere terrified me. I returned to the cabin and called the local sheriff from the landline, explaining the situation. They said they'd send someone out in the morning, but until then, I was on my own. That night, I stayed awake in the living room with the fire blazing, the knife close at hand. Around midnight, the noises started again. Footsteps circling the cabin, soft thumps against the walls, and the unmistakable scrape of metal on wood. I held my breath, ready to defend myself. After what felt like hours, the noises stopped, and dawn finally broke through the grimy windows. The sheriff arrived mid-morning, a tall man with a weathered face and a calm presence. We walked the property together, him noting the footprints and broken fence. He told me there had been a string of break-ins in the area, local thieves targeting isolated farms for tools and equipment. The sheriff promised to keep a patrol near the farm and advised me to keep the doors locked and report any further incidents. I stayed the rest of the month, but the visits stopped after that. The sheriff's patrols seemed to keep whoever it was at bay. I repaired the fence better than before, cleared the underbrush around the cabin to improve visibility, and made sure the cabin was as secure as possible. The farm was no longer just a quiet retreat. It had become a place where I learned to be alert and strong. The solitude that had once been peaceful now carried the weight of knowing how quickly things could turn dangerous. When I finally left, I felt different. The farm had tested me in ways I didn't expect. It taught me that real fear isn't about ghosts or stories, but about the very real dangers hidden in silence and shadows, about the people who wander in the dark looking for trouble. I never found out exactly who had been on the farm that spring. Maybe they were just desperate thieves, or maybe someone with a grudge. But I learned to trust my instincts and respect the wild, quiet places where danger often hides unseen. The cabin still stands, weathered and waiting, a reminder that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones without monsters, just the cold truth of being alone, exposed, and watched. It was early October 2016, and the leaves were just starting to change up north. I was 34, living in Pittsburgh, and going through a stretch where I needed to get away from everything. My job had been grinding me down, and things at home were tense. I was single, no kids, just me and my dog, Huck. He was a 7-year-old German Shepherd mix I'd adopted from a rescue in Ohio 2 years earlier. Big, quiet, and loyal in that intense, unreadable way shepherds can be. I'd rented a small cabin in north central Pennsylvania on a patch of land owned by an old friend's cousin. It wasn't listed online, just a little wooden place he used for hunting a few times a year with no electricity, no cell service, and no one around for miles. I paid him a few $100 in cash for 5 days and got directions written out by hand. It was way off the main road, tucked near the edge of Sproul State Forest down a trail that barely passed for a road once you left the gravel behind. It took most of the day to drive there, and by the time I made it up the last rough mile, it was nearly dark. The cabin was small, maybe 400 square feet, with a front porch and a rusted-out metal chimney. Inside, there was a wood stove, a cot, a sagging couch, and a table with 2 chairs. No fridge, no lights, just oil lamps, matches, and a few empty mousetraps. I unpacked the cooler, lit a lamp, and laid out my sleeping bag on the cot. Huck sniffed every inch of the place, then settled at the foot of the bed like he always did. I remember thinking it felt good to be out there, away from everything. No noise, but the wind and the soft sounds of leaves falling. The first night passed quietly. It got cold enough that I had to feed the stove around midnight, but other than that, it was still. Huck didn't bark or growl, which usually meant nothing came too close. I trusted his instincts more than my own. The next day, I took him hiking. There were no trails marked, but the woods were open enough to walk through. We found a ridge that dropped into a long valley with a creek running along the bottom. Everything smelled sharp and wet. I saw a few deer, a raccoon, and some kind of big bird I couldn't name. We hiked for a few hours, then looped back. It was maybe 2 in the afternoon. Then I spotted something odd near the cabin. At first, I thought it was just more fallen branches or old firewood someone had stacked. But the closer I got, the more I saw it wasn't right. There were small piles of stones arranged in shapes, circles mostly, a few with straight lines leading out of them like compass points. Maybe 10 or 12 piles, each about the size of a dinner plate, set into the soft dirt and moss behind the cabin. I'd walked around that side the night before when I let Huck out and hadn't seen anything. I don't know what I thought. Maybe I figured it was some kind of old marker from hunters, or maybe just some kid who stayed here once and played around with rocks. I kicked one over without thinking. Huck didn't react. He just stood there, staring into the trees. Later that night, just after dark, I was making some soup over the stove when Huck stood up. No sound. He just stood, ears up, facing the window. I paused and listened. Nothing. A few minutes passed and he growled once, low and short. Then he went quiet again. I put the soup down and opened the door. The woods were dark, thick shadows and no moon. Yeah, I had a flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I just listened. I could hear a few night insects, some wind up high in the trees, and the soft creak of the cabin settling. But I could feel it, that heavy stillness, the kind that makes the hair on your arms lift. I closed the door, locked it, and pulled the heavy latch across. Huck stayed on alert for almost an hour, then laid back down. The second night, I barely slept. I kept waking up thinking I heard something, sticks cracking or a shuffle in the dirt. Every time I sat up, it was quiet again. Huck didn't bark or whine, just stayed by the cot, ears twitching. At one point, he did that slow, low growl again, but he didn't move. The next morning, I found more of those stone piles, 3 of them. New ones. Same size, same shapes, right behind the cabin again. I knew they weren't there the day before. I took pictures on my phone, even though I had no service. I stared at them for a long time, trying to figure it out. Maybe some local kids, hikers, but how would they even know I was out here? I hadn't seen a single person since leaving the highway. No cars, no voices, no distant sounds of anything human. I walked out a ways with Huck, trying to spot any other camps, any old tree stands, anything that would tell me someone else had been through. I didn't see anything. That evening, I set up a kind of perimeter with some fishing line I found in a drawer inside the cabin. I tied it between trees, low to the ground, hoping I'd hear it snap if anyone came close. It felt stupid while I was doing it, but it was all I had. I didn't bring a gun, just a hatchet and a big hunting knife I kept near the bed. I didn't start a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold food and sat in the dark. Huck stayed close, watching the door. Around midnight, I heard it. The soft crunch of footsteps, not animals, not squirrels or raccoons. These were slow, heavy steps, a couple at a time, then nothing, then a few more, always circling. Huck stood stiff as stone and stared at the door, his lip curled. He didn't bark, just growled, the deepest I'd ever heard. I waited, holding my breath, knife in hand. The footsteps never came closer than maybe 20 feet. I couldn't see anything through the window, just black trees and fog on the glass. After maybe 20 minutes, they stopped. In the morning, all the fishing line was gone, cut clean in 3 places, not broken, not snapped. Clean cuts, like with scissors or a knife. Another stone pile sat dead center on the front step. I packed. I didn't even think about it. I threw everything into the car as fast as I could. I kept the knife on my belt and didn't let Huck out of my sight. I didn't even check the back of the cabin. I just loaded up and started driving. The dirt trail was worse than I remembered, full of sharp rocks and tight turns. I had to go slow. Less than 2 miles in, I saw something off the trail, something shiny. I stopped. It was a trail camera, one of those hunting motion cameras strapped to a tree with a camo box. I only noticed it because the sun caught the lens just right. It had a thick strap and a fresh battery pack. It wasn't there when I drove in. I would have noticed. It was aimed right at the trail. I didn't touch it. I kept driving. It took 4 hours to reach a main road. I stopped at a gas station, used the bathroom, and just stood there at the sink staring at myself. Huck was in the car. Looking back toward the woods, I called the guy who owned the cabin and told him something was wrong up there. He just laughed like I was being dramatic, said the land was empty for miles, said the stone piles were probably just old markers or hippie crap. He told me people spook themselves in the woods all the time, maybe, but I never went back. I didn't tell anyone else. I kept the pictures on my phone for a few years, but I deleted them eventually. I still don't like looking at stone piles. I haven't been back in deep woods since Huck passed away 2 years ago, right before Christmas. He was 12. I had him cremated and kept the box on my shelf. Sometimes still dream about that cabin, the cold, the silence, the crunch of footsteps outside the door. And the worst part of it all, the part I try not to think about, is that Huck never barked. Not once. He always barked when people got close. Whatever was out there, it wasn't walking like it wanted to be noticed. It was watching, waiting, careful, and it knew how not to make a sound. I didn't expect to feel so out of place. The car bumped over the dirt road, thick with gravel and dust that rose in little clouds behind me. The summer sun beat down through the tall pines, making the shadows sharp but short. I glanced at the speedometer. It wasn't much over 30 miles per hour, but the roughness of the road made it feel like a roller coaster. The air smelled like dry earth and pine needles crushed under tires. The cabin sat at the end of the road, tucked away in a small clearing surrounded by tall evergreens that seemed to lean in close like they were guarding it. The place was older than I remembered from my last visit, maybe 20 years ago when I was a kid. Time had done its work. The wooden siding had faded from dark brown to a dull gray, and the roof had patches where the shingles were curling and missing. The porch sagged a little, and the steps creaked when I climbed them. Still, it was home to my memories, and now for a few days, it would be my refuge. I had come here to escape. My job was draining me. The city was loud and relentless, full of people rushing around with their own problems and no time to notice you. Here, in the middle of the woods of northern Vermont, I thought I could find a bit of peace, maybe figure out what was next for me. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly like the scent of my grandma's lavender soap. The furniture was rough and plain. A wooden table, a few chairs, an old couch with faded cushions, and shelves with dusty books and some family photos. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, but the windows let in enough afternoon sun to warm the room. I set my bags down and opened the windows wide, letting the fresh air in. The first night came quickly. I cooked a simple meal on the small stove, the kind that used propane tanks stored outside. The flames flickered orange and yellow as I stirred canned beans and boiled some water for coffee. Outside, the woods settled into silence, broken only by the occasional call of a distant bird or the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. I sat on the porch steps after dinner, drinking my coffee, watching the stars begin to prick the dark sky. The forest was still, but it felt heavy somehow, like the trees were waiting, watching. I told myself it was just my imagination, tired from work and the city noise. That night, I heard something outside the cabin, not the usual night sounds of small animals and birds or the wind through the trees. It was heavier, slower, a crunching on the gravel path. Then a pause, like someone was standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. I held my breath, eyes straining in the dark, but saw nothing except shadows dancing in the moonlight. I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the old cabin, every whisper of wind felt louder, closer. The next morning, I checked the perimeter. Nothing seemed out of place. No footprints, no signs that someone had been here. Just the soft earth and pine needles. As the days passed, I settled into a quiet routine. Mornings spent chopping wood for the stove, afternoons hiking along narrow trails that curled through the dense forest, evenings reading by the fire. The cabin felt like a small island of calm, yet that feeling from the first night lingered like a shadow behind my thoughts. One afternoon, I found broken branches near the creek, not far from the cabin. At first, I thought a deer had passed through, but the breaks were too deliberate, too low, like someone had pushed through the bushes quickly. I scanned the trees but saw no one. I told myself again it was probably just a bear or some other animal, but a small knot of unease settled in my stomach. I decided to double-check the locks on the doors and windows. The cabin was old and not very secure, just simple latches that didn't feel like much of a barrier. I also moved some of the heavier furniture to block the doors at night. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but I was. On the fourth night, the noises returned, this time louder, more persistent. Footsteps on the gravel, accompanied by the faint snapping of twigs closer to the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, flicked it on, and shone it toward the dark edge of the clearing. There was nothing, but the feeling of being watched grew. I stayed on the porch, flashlight sweeping the trees until I felt my arms grow tired and the cold night air seeped through my thin jacket. Eventually, the noises stopped, and I forced myself back inside, locking the doors behind me. I tried to tell myself it was just some local kid messing around or maybe a hunter who had wandered too close, but the unease gnawed at me. The next day, I took a longer walk further from the cabin, trying to clear my head. The woods were beautiful and peaceful, with sunlight filtering through the branches and birds singing high above. I even found a small, hidden pond, a quiet, glassy pool surrounded by ferns. For a moment, I felt that peace I'd been craving. On my way back, I noticed something on the path, an old, rusty hunting knife, partially buried under the dirt and leaves. It looked ancient, but it was sharp and heavy. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. Why was it here? I slipped it into my backpack, thinking I might keep it for protection. That night, I slept lightly. The shadows outside seemed deeper. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin's old window frames and shaking the door latch. I checked every lock twice. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, a loud thump jolted me awake. Something heavy had struck the side of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and the hunting knife from the backpack and crept toward the door. The moonlight spilled across the porch, and I saw deep marks in the wood, long scratches as if something had tried to force its way in. My heart pounded. I stayed inside, shining the flashlight out into the blackness, but there was nothing visible. The next morning I found more signs, footprints in the mud near the cabin, too large and too human to be an animal. They were fresh, leading away from the porch into the dense woods. I followed them a little, but they disappeared near a rocky ridge. I packed a small bag and decided I needed to leave soon. The isolation, the strange noises, the marks, something was not right. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It felt like a trap. Before leaving, I called my cousin, who lived about an hour away in the nearest town. I told him what was happening. He promised to check the cabin while I was gone. That night, I barely slept. The noises came again, footsteps, the scratching, and now a low murmur that I couldn't understand, almost like whispered voices. I sat by the window, knife in hand, waiting for dawn. When morning came, I packed quickly, then stepped outside. The forest was calm again, but I didn't trust it. As I locked the cabin door behind me, a figure emerged from the trees. Not a shadow, but a man. He was rough-looking, wearing a dirty jacket and boots. His face was weathered, his eyes cold. He said nothing but stared at me. Something in his silence felt worse than any threat. Without thinking, I turned and started walking down the road. He didn't follow. After a long walk, I reached my car and drove away, leaving the cabin and the woods behind. Days later, my cousin called. He said he found footprints and broken branches all around the cabin, but no sign of the man. He'd also found some discarded cans and old campfires not far from the clearing. We agreed. The cabin wasn't safe anymore. I haven't been back since. It was the summer of 2003 when I decided to take a break from my city life and spend some time alone. In the woods, I was 34 years old, working as a graphic designer in Chicago. Life had been overwhelming. Long hours at the office, constant noise, and the pressure of deadlines. I needed a quiet place to think, somewhere untouched by the city's chaos. That's how I ended up renting a small cabin in the middle of nowhere, deep in the forests of northern Minnesota, near a place called Black Pine Ridge. The cabin was old but sturdy, built sometime in the 1950s by a local logger. It sat at the end of a gravel road that twisted through the dense pine forest for miles. I rented it from a man named Carl who lived in a nearby town about 20 miles away. He warned me the area was remote with little cell phone service and that I should be prepared to fend for myself. That was exactly what I wanted. I arrived just as the sun was setting, driving my old pickup truck along the narrow dirt path that led up the ridge. The forest was thick and dark, and the tall pines towered over me like silent giants. The air smelled fresh, but carried a faint hint of decay, rotting leaves and moss. When I pulled up to the cabin, I saw the wooden porch, weathered and cracked from years of wind and snow, and the windows were dusty but intact. Inside, the cabin was small and simple, a single room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area with a rusty sink, a table, and a cot pushed into one corner. There was no electricity, just a few oil lamps and a pile of firewood stacked neatly next to the door. It felt good, bare bones, honest. I unpacked my things slowly, enjoying the silence. No traffic, no sirens, just the faint sound of wind rustling through the branches outside. The first night passed quietly. I built a fire in the stove, cooked some canned beans and rice, then lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl outside. I felt at peace. The next morning, I woke early to a bright sky. The forest was alive with birdsong and the smell of pine resin. I took my backpack and headed out on a small trail that ran behind the cabin, hoping to explore. The trail was narrow, covered with fallen needles and broken twigs, and it wound deeper into the woods. As I walked, I noticed the silence in the forest was different from the city. Here, it wasn't empty, but full of subtle sounds, leaves shifting underfoot, distant woodpeckers tapping on trunks, a squirrel scurrying up a tree. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. I spent the day hiking, drinking water from a small stream, and watching the wildlife. At one point, I saw a deer grazing near a clearing. It looked at me with big, cautious eyes before darting into the trees. The peace of the forest was intoxicating. By the third day, I was settled into a rhythm. Wake up early, explore, gather wood, cook simple meals, and read by the fire at night. The isolation was exactly what I needed to clear my mind. But then, on the evening of the fourth day, something changed. I had been sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air grew cooler and the shadows lengthened. Suddenly, I heard a noise. Not the usual forest sounds, but something else. A soft, slow crunching of footsteps on gravel from the direction of the road. At first, I thought it was another hiker, or perhaps Carl coming by to check on the cabin. But the gravel road was miles from any neighbor, and Carl had said he wouldn't come unless I called him. No one knew I was here except him. I stood up and looked toward the road. The dusk made it hard to see far, but I could make out a vague shape moving slowly between the trees. It was too big to be a deer or any wild animal, My heart rate quickened. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped off the porch, shining the beam down the road. The figure stopped. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a large animal. The trees blocked most of my view. The crunching sounds stopped. Then, after a few moments, I heard soft thuds like heavy boots on dirt. I retreated inside quickly and locked the door, pulling the curtains closed. I stared at the window, heart pounding, waiting to see if the figure would come closer. Nothing happened for a while. Then the crunching started again, slow steps, moving toward the cabin, circling around it. I held my breath. I remembered the hunting knife I had brought in my bag. I grabbed it and held it tightly. The sound stopped suddenly, and there was silence again. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise made me jump. The wind, the creaking of the cabin, twigs breaking outside. I kept the door locked and my flashlight nearby. The next morning, I stepped outside cautiously. The gravel around the cabin was disturbed. Footprints, large, heavy boots. They circled the cabin but didn't come closer than 10 feet from the porch. I examined the prints carefully. They looked recent, maybe from the night before. That was when I realized someone had been watching me. I stayed inside most of the day, nervously peeking through the windows. I thought about calling Carl, but the phone line was dead, and there was no cell service. That night, the sounds returned. But this time they were accompanied by low grunts and whispers. Barely audible, but enough to freeze my blood. I stayed awake until dawn, too scared to move. I kept my knife close and a fire burning in the stove. On the morning of the 6th day, I found a strange message scratched into the porch railing with a knife. Leave. Risk. I wasn't sure if it was meant to threaten me or warn me, but either way, I knew I couldn't stay. That day, I packed everything quickly and prepared to leave. The road was long and rough, and I was worried about encountering whoever had been stalking me. As I drove down the ridge, I kept my eyes on the trees, alert for any movement. About halfway down, I saw a man standing by the side of the road, a large figure wearing dark clothes and a cap, his face partially hidden in shadow. He didn't move as I passed, but watched me closely. I didn't stop. I kept going until I reached the town. In town, I told Carl what happened. He wasn't surprised. He said the area had some local troublemakers who didn't like outsiders coming in and that others had similar experiences. He offered to help me get a refund, and I agreed. I never went back to Black Pine Ridge. The experience left me shaken, but it also taught me something important. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but real people who live in the shadows. The cabin in the woods was supposed to be a place of peace, but it became a trap. The isolation made me vulnerable to someone who didn't want me there. Looking back, I realize I underestimated how quickly solitude can turn into fear when someone else has different plans. I'm thankful I left when I did. The forest is beautiful, but it also hides many secrets, some darker than any shadow. My name is Mark, and this story took place in the late fall of 1996. I was 27 then, working construction in northern Idaho. I don't remember exactly how I got the idea to spend a weekend out in the woods by myself, but I think it was partly because I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, and partly because I needed a break from work. The air in Spokane, where I lived, was thick with dust and smoke from the fires burning all around the state that fall, and my lungs were sore. I wanted fresh air, quiet, and solitude. I found a small cabin listed for rent near Priest Lake, about 3 hours north of Spokane. It was an old wooden cabin standing near the edge of the forest, about 100 yards from the lake shore. The cabin didn't have electricity or running water, which was perfect for what I wanted. No distractions. The owner said it was used mostly by fishermen and hunters during the summer and fall. I booked it for 3 days and planned to hike, fish, and just be alone. I arrived on a cold Thursday afternoon. The leaves on the trees were already turning rusty orange and yellow, and a thin layer of frost covered the ground. I parked my old pickup truck at the gravel road's end, where the cabin sat. The place was quiet, except for the occasional call of a distant bird or the faint rustling of branches in the wind. The cabin was small, about 15 feet by 20 feet, with a porch that creaked under my boots. The wood was dark and weathered, soaked with years of rain and snow. The door had a rusty latch, and inside the smell was musty but not unbearable. A wood stove sat in the corner, cold and empty. A rough wooden table and 2 chairs were pushed against the wall, and a simple bed frame with an old mattress stood in the back corner. I unpacked my gear slowly, laying out my sleeping bag, fishing rod, and supplies. The sun was already dipping behind the trees by the time I got the fire going outside. I stacked some dry logs and lit the fire, watching the flames crackle and spit. The heat was comforting in the chilly air. That first night was quiet and peaceful. I slept with the windows open a crack, the cool breeze whispering in through the trees. I woke a few times to the sounds of animals moving nearby, but never felt unsafe. This place felt remote but not lonely. The next day, I hiked along the lake shore and tried fishing, though I didn't catch much. The water was cold and clear, reflecting the overcast sky. The woods around me were thick with pine and fir trees, their needles soft underfoot. I walked slowly, trying to take in every detail. The sound of the wind through the branches, the sharp smell of pine sap, the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots. That evening, after a simple meal of canned beans warmed on the fire, I decided to explore a little further into the woods behind the cabin. The trees grew denser, the light fading fast. I moved carefully, following a faint trail marked by old blazes on trees. The forest smelled damp and alive. That's when I first noticed it, the faint, rotten smell. It was subtle at first, almost like something dead and wet buried beneath the forest floor. I stopped, sniffing the air. The smell grew stronger, sour and heavy. I looked around but saw nothing unusual, no broken branches or animal tracks. I kept walking, the smell now unmistakable. It was thick and unpleasant, like decay. My heart started to beat faster. I told myself it was probably just some dead animal carcass, a deer or something that had died days ago. But as I walked on, the trail opened into a small clearing. In the middle of that clearing was an old abandoned cabin. It wasn't on any map I had, and the rental owner never mentioned it. The wood was gray and rotten, with chunks missing from the walls. The roof sagged, and the door hung open on rusted hinges. Curious but cautious, I stepped closer. The rotten smell was much stronger now, making my stomach turn. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it inside. The beam caught something lying on the floor, something pale and twisted. I dropped my pack and stepped back, heart pounding. It was a body, not just any body, but a man, or what was left of one. His clothes were torn and filthy, face swollen and unrecognizable. His hands were stretched out, frozen in a grim claw-like gesture. The skin was grayish and shriveled, and the air around him buzzed with flies. I swallowed hard and tried not to panic. My mind raced with questions. Who was this? How long had he been there? Was this some kind of crime scene? My instincts screamed at me to leave immediately and call the police. But before I turned around, I noticed something else. Next to the body on the floor was a small soaked notebook. I stepped closer again and picked it up, careful not to touch the body. The pages were waterlogged and stained, but some writing was still visible. The words were faint but readable. It looked like a journal, a last record of someone trapped or lost in these woods. I read bits here and there, the handwriting shaky and hurried. I don't know how long I've been here. The food ran out days ago. The cold is unbearable. I hear them outside, moving in the dark. I'm scared. If anyone finds this, please help. The last page was smeared with blood and dirt, the words trailing off into scratches. I closed the notebook, heart heavy. I realized the man must have been lost or trapped here for days or weeks, left to die alone in this forgotten cabin. I felt a deep sadness mixed with fear. This place held a secret no one had found, until now. I took out my phone to call the sheriff, but there was no signal. I was too far in the woods. I would have to drive back to the main road to get help. I took a deep breath and stepped away from the cabin, leaving the body behind, but not forgotten. When I got back to my rental cabin, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the man and his last days in that cabin. I decided that in the morning I would report what I found. The next day, I drove down the gravel road to the ranger station. I'd told the man inside what I saw, gave him the location, and handed over the notebook. The ranger looked grave and called the sheriff's office. By evening, a search team arrived with forensic experts. They cordoned off the old cabin and began their work. I stayed back but watched from a distance. Later, I learned that the man had been a missing hiker from Washington who disappeared months earlier. His body was finally found because of me. It haunted me for a long time, thinking about how close I was to becoming part of a forgotten story in those woods. I realized how fragile life is and how easily someone can vanish without a trace. The experience changed me. I stopped taking nature for granted and learned to respect its power and silence. The dead man's cabin became a reminder that sometimes the wilderness holds dark secrets, but it's up to us to uncover them and give them a voice. I was 34 when I took a maintenance job that had me living out of a cabin for a few weeks at a time. It was the kind of thing I wouldn't have done if life hadn't cornered me into it. I'd just gotten out of a divorce that wiped me clean, and the idea of isolating for a while actually felt like relief. The position was with a timber company that leased old DNR land up north past H. Houghton in the deeper parts of the Upper Peninsula. The cabin sat alone on a cleared slope, surrounded by thick pines and poplars. A single gravel road led in about 8 miles from the nearest paved stretch. It wasn't built for beauty. 2 rooms, single-pane windows, thin insulation, a propane heater, a generator for power, and an outhouse about 30 yards out. The company used it as a service outpost. I was tasked with keeping the generators running, clearing the snow, checking the radio relays, and making sure no squatters were in the area. They told me to be ready for the cold, said it could get down to -20 at night. I brought enough gear to stay warm and fed, but I didn't bring a whole lot else. I thought it'd be a quiet few weeks with firewood, canned food, and a thermos of black coffee always nearby. Just work, eat, sleep, repeat. That's how the first few days went. I shoveled snow, ran test signals on the old radios, and walked a few of the trails the loggers used. The company would check in twice a week by radio, and the rest of the time I was completely on my own. The first time I felt something was off was around the 6th night. I had been reading an old Reader's Digest I found on a shelf and drinking coffee by the propane heater when I noticed something strange. The snow on the step outside the cabin had a long, thin track through it, like something had been dragged. It ran from the tree line up to the porch. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer that got injured and slid around, but there was no blood, no hoof marks, just one long, smooth, deliberate trail. It was maybe 6 inches wide and curled just slightly at the end, like something had been pulled. I stood there staring at it until the wind covered it up with a new dusting of snow. I chalked it up to a fallen branch that got blown across the snow. Still, I checked the area around the cabin. Nothing out of place, no tracks leading in or out, no sign of a struggle. I told myself I was being jumpy. The wind and the cold do weird things when you're alone. I locked the door that night and pushed a chair under the knob, just in case. The days stayed quiet. It was always cold, and I kept my gloves and boots on most of the time, even inside. I'd chop wood, check the antenna, keep the generator gassed, and walk a perimeter line that looped about half a mile through the woods and back. The snow was thick, and I had to stomp it down over and over. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything but wind and the occasional cracking of trees under frost. But things started feeling watched, like when I bent down to refill the generator or scraped ice off the antenna dish. I'd get this prickly sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was in the woods looking, waiting. I'd stop what I was doing and listen, but it was always quiet, still, too still. No birds, no rustling, not even the sound of small animals. That silence isn't natural, not in winter woods. There's always something. I tried telling myself that it was just too cold for wildlife, but even that didn't sit right. I started checking the snow more closely each morning, and sure enough, about a week in, I saw new signs. Footprints, not boots, bare feet. Human, but narrow and long, like someone who hadn't worn shoes in years. The prints came down from the slope behind the outhouse and stopped at the side of the cabin. Then, nothing. No return trail. No signs of someone laying down or backtracking, just a row of prints leading in and gone. I didn't have a gun with me, just a hatchet and a flare gun for emergencies. I kept both closer after that. Slept with the hatchet under my cot. I didn't tell the company anything over the radio. Didn't want to sound paranoid. I started taking shorter walks and didn't go too far past the tree line anymore. One morning, I woke up to the smell of diesel, not from the generator. That one had been empty since late the night before. It was coming from outside. I stepped onto the porch, and there was a long streak of diesel fuel sprayed across the snow. It led from the fuel can I'd left near the generator all the way to the trees. The can was still upright, no footprints, just fuel. I started thinking maybe someone was messing with me, a local, maybe some drifter who didn't like company. But I couldn't figure out how they got in and out without leaving more signs. I'd been checking the road every day. No tire tracks. Just the same undisturbed white. That night I didn't sleep. I turned off the heater so I could hear better and stayed wrapped in 3 layers, sitting on the edge of my cot with the hatchet in one hand. I heard noises around 2 a.m. Not loud, but deliberate, like soft, crunching footsteps in the snow. Then tapping on the wall, not random. 3 taps, then a pause, then 2 more. Then silence. I didn't move, just stared at the door. I didn't even breathe hard. I waited like that until light started to come through the frosted window. When I finally stepped outside, nothing. No prints, no scratches. But the tapping had been real. I hadn't imagined that. From that day, everything felt off. The forest seemed darker, even during the daytime. The trails I walked looked slightly different, like trees had moved or bent at angles that weren't there before. The cabin creaked more. There were odd smells, copper, rot, and old dirt that would come and go without warning. I found dead things too. A rabbit split clean down the middle, no signs of struggle. A raccoon with its eyes missing but no other marks. Once I came back from a half-hour walk and found the front door wide open. Nothing inside had been touched, but the door had been latched when I left. It didn't swing open on its own. The worst was near the end of the second week. I was refilling the generator again, keeping an eye on the woods, when I noticed something nailed to the back of the outhouse. A strip of deer hide, long, narrow, and stretched tight, cleanly cut and pinned up with 3 rusted nails. I hadn't seen it the day before. It hadn't been there. I walked a wide circle around the cabin that day. Still no sign of anyone. Still no tracks. And that's when it hit me, that whoever or whatever was doing this wasn't coming by road. They were already here, living out in the trees. Watching. Waiting. I decided I'd had enough. I radioed the company that evening and said I needed to be rotated out early. Said the generator had issues and the signal equipment needed checking. They said it would be 3 days before someone could come. A snowstorm was blowing in, and the roads would be shut for at least 48 hours. I didn't sleep much those 3 days. I kept the fire small and stayed quiet. Didn't go outside more than I had to. Every hour or so, I'd hear distant noises, sometimes knocking, sometimes the low thud of something moving against the wall, sometimes breathing, not mine. Just past the window, controlled, shallow breathing. On the last night before pickup, I heard the door handle rattle once, then again, then a slow, heavy pressure against the door, like someone was leaning on it. I stood there, frozen, holding the hatchet in my fist, not moving an inch. The pressure stopped after maybe 10 seconds, then silence. I didn't sleep, just waited for daylight. When the pickup truck finally arrived the next morning, I ran out to meet it with my pack already on. I didn't say much to the driver, just that I was ready to go. As we drove off, I looked back once at the cabin. Nothing there. Just a quiet slope, thin smoke from the chimney, and cold stillness. But I knew something had been there. Back at the main office, I filed a report. I didn't lie, but I didn't go into all the details either. I said there were signs of wildlife activity near the cabin, that I suspected a poacher or squatter had been nearby. They nodded and said they'd check it out when the snow cleared. I didn't stick around to find out if they did. I took a job in southern Michigan after that, concrete repair. Loud, busy, hot, all things I used to hate. Now I can't get enough of it. I've never gone back up there. I still think about it though. Not every day, but often enough when the night's too quiet or when I smell diesel in the air. Sometimes I dream about the tapping on the wall. 3 times. Pause. 2 more. And sometimes just before waking, I dream that the cabin door finally opens, not with force, but slow, deliberate, and something walks in. But I never see it. And I never want to. It was late September of 2016 when I decided to take the long road back from a contracting job near the Oregon border. I was 43, then tired in a way that seeps into your bones, and I thought taking the mountain route down through Northern California might give me some peace. I had just wrapped up 4 weeks of grueling work on a roofing project in Medford, and I didn't feel like dealing with the highway traffic back through the I-5 corridor. I wanted silence. I wanted pine trees and winding roads, and something that felt a little more human than billboards and fast food chains. I didn't plan on passing her cabin. In fact, I hadn't thought of her in months. We'd been divorced for almost 6 years, and I thought I'd buried everything about that part of my life in a locked room. In the back of my mind, her name was Anna. We were married for 9 years. She bought the cabin before we split, a place up in Siskiyou County tucked along a forgotten dirt road that peeled off State Route 3. I helped her finish the inside before I moved out. It wasn't really a shared project, but I put in the effort. Laid the pine flooring, built out the kitchen shelves, stained the deck. I had my hands in that place, even if I never spent a night there after the divorce. The sun was hanging low. When I turned onto the road that led past her place, I wasn't even thinking about it until I saw that warped green sign, Lost Creek Road. My stomach did a strange little turn. I told myself it was just curiosity, maybe even nostalgia. I hadn't been down this road in half a decade, and part of me just wanted to see it again. Just a glance. I told myself nothing more. The road hadn't changed much. Still narrow, still bumpy, still lined with tall pines on both sides like walls closing in. My truck kicked up clouds of dirt behind me as I eased around the bends. There were no other vehicles, not even tire marks. This road had always been quiet, which was part of the reason Anna picked it in the first place. Her cabin sat about 2 miles in, a squat little A-frame with dark brown siding and a wide porch. I slowed as I approached. It looked abandoned. That's the first word that came to mind. The windows were dark, and the grass had grown up in patches around the gravel drive. One of the gutters had come loose and hung down like a crooked arm. The mailbox was missing entirely. I rolled to a stop just before the driveway. My hands stayed on the steering wheel, fingers tightening without me meaning to. The place gave off a feeling, Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Unease maybe, or tension like the kind of quiet you get just before a thunderstorm. I stared at the front door, half expecting to see her walk out, even though I knew she'd moved to Reno years ago. After a few minutes, I pulled in. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to see it up close. Maybe I wanted to remind myself it was just wood and nails, that it didn't have anything left in it. I parked just off the side and got out. The air smelled like dry leaves and pine sap. Evening was coming in fast. I stood there for a while, not moving, just looking at the place. The shutters were partly closed and one of them had a hinge broken off. The whole place looked like it hadn't been lived in for a long time. I walked up the front steps. They creaked under my boots. The doormat was gone, but I remembered the spot where we had once buried a spare key under a loose floorboard on the porch. I wasn't looking for a reason to go inside. I was just following a path my memory laid out. The key was still there. That should have been the moment I turned around and left, but I didn't. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. It smelled like stale air and old wood, the kind of smell a place gets when it's been shut tight for too long. Dust hung in the air like fog, and the light through the windows was faint and orange. It was exactly as I remembered it, but more hollow. The living room was bare except for the old sofa we'd hauled up from reading one summer. A thin sheet covered it, and when I lifted it, I saw the fabric was faded and moth-eaten. The wood stove in the corner was still intact, though the pipe looked rusted around the base. I walked through the kitchen past the counter I'd installed myself. The sink had a rust ring where a pan must have sat for years. The cupboards were open and empty. No plates, no glasses, not even dust. Just nothing. I climbed the narrow stairs to the loft. That room was where the bed had been. Now it was just floorboards and shadows. A few old boxes sat stacked against the wall. I didn't open them. On my way back down, I noticed something I hadn't before. A series of long scratches on the wall by the stairs, not fresh. The paint had chipped around the edges, and they looked deep, too deep for a cat or raccoon, more like gouges. Parallel lines, almost uniform. I stared at them for a long time, trying to find a reasonable explanation. Maybe she'd had some kind of furniture accident. Maybe she moved something heavy down the stairs. But they didn't make sense. I left the house quickly after that. The air felt thicker, the kind of thickness that presses in on your chest. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing through my nose, trying to calm whatever had started to rise in me. I looked out toward the trees and noticed something else. Footprints leading away from the cabin into the woods. They were faint, but the ground had been soft from the week's earlier rain, and they stood out just enough to catch my attention. The strange part was how fresh they looked, not crisp, but recent enough that the edges weren't washed out. No boot tread either, just smooth, solid impressions, bare feet. I followed them. They led down past the clearing behind the house, through the tall grass and into the tree line. I kept walking, part of me yelling to stop. The rest of me pulled forward, like I was caught in a loop. I couldn't break the pattern. They led through the pines around a small bend in the hill and into a tight space between two granite outcrops. I had to squeeze through sideways, scraping my shoulder against the rock. On the other side was something I hadn't seen before. A hole, maybe 6 feet across, almost perfectly round, like someone had dug it with a machine. But the area around it was untouched. No tracks, no equipment, just the hole. It wasn't a well. It didn't have bricks or lining, just a deep black pit in the forest floor. I picked up a stone the size of my fist and dropped it in. I waited 5 seconds, 10. Nothing. No sound. Just silence. That's when I felt it, not a presence. I don't believe in that sort of thing, but a change in the air, like the pressure dropped all at once, like something was about to happen. I turned and got out of there fast. I didn't look back. I retraced the footprints, jogged past the cabin, and got into my truck. I slammed the door, and sat there for a minute, heart thudding against my ribs, sweat cold on my neck. I looked at the cabin one last time. The upstairs window was dark, but I swear it had been open when I went in. The drive out felt longer than it should have. Every bend in the road made me grip the wheel tighter. I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced I'd see something behind me, someone walking. But there was nothing, just empty road. That night, I slept at a rest stop off the main highway. I didn't feel like checking into a motel. I didn't feel like being around people. I didn't even just leaned the seat back and stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. The next morning, I called a friend of mine who works for the county. I didn't give details, just asked him to look up any records tied to the property. He called me back 2 days later. There was no record of a sale. Anna had never sold the cabin, but she didn't own it anymore. Either it had reverted to county property after it was forcibly vacated in 2014. The report didn't say much, just that the house was found abandoned and that the interior showed evidence of extended habitation despite no known occupants. I asked if anyone had gone missing. He paused and said he wasn't supposed to talk about it, but then he added one thing. In late 2013, a couple hikers went missing in that same area. Their car was found parked off the same dirt road. They were never found. I didn't go back. I didn't try to find the hole again. I deleted the county files off my phone and tried not to think about any of it. But sometimes late at night when I'm driving through the hills, I'll get that same feeling, like the air has shifted, like the pressure's changed. And I remember that pit in the woods. I remember the cabin. I remember the silence. I know what I saw and I know what I felt. Some things don't need answers. Some things are better left behind. I've kept to the highways ever since. It was October of 2017. When I took a solo trip up north, I was 38 at the time, living in a quiet corner of Kansas, working as a land surveyor. Work had slowed down a bit and my head was all over the place. Bills, repairs at home, stress from a recent breakup. I needed to disappear for a few days away from the phone, the house, everything. I had an old hunting cabin my uncle left me near the Nebraska border. It sat out near a patch of land that hadn't seen traffic in years, not even from the few guys who hunted out there during deer season. The cabin was small, just one room with a cot, an old stove, a steel sink, and some beat-up furniture. But it had everything I needed. It had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and barely enough power from the generator to run lights. At night, perfect. I packed up my Remington 700, a few essentials, a cooler with food, and headed out early one Thursday morning. The drive took just under 5 hours, with the last stretch being a gravel road that wound into the forest. No signs, no markers, just dirt, trees, and the crunch of my tires. I arrived just before noon. The place looked the same as I remembered it. Weather-beaten siding, rusted tin roof, and the little porch out front with a broken railing. The lock on the door was stiff and the hinges creaked loud when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and dry. It smelled like old firewood, dust, and damp fabric. I lit the oil lamp hanging by the door, swept out a few mouse droppings, and got to work unpacking. The first day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon walking the trails, marking trees, checking for any fresh tracks. I saw a few rabbit prints, maybe a raccoon, no signs of deer. That didn't bother me. I wasn't there just to hunt. I sat by the fire pit that evening, drinking coffee and staring out at the black tree line. It was dead quiet. The kind of silence that gets under your skin after a while. That night, I slept with my rifle by the cot, like I always did. Nothing happened, just the wind brushing against the cabin and the occasional creak of the beams. The second day started like any other. I cooked some eggs on the little propane stove, then took off deeper into the woods. I had a trail camera I wanted to set up by a narrow game trail that led down into a dry creek bed. As I walked, I noticed something strange. There were fresh boot prints in the mud, not mine. They were deeper and wider, and they went off the trail toward the east. That was odd. No one else was supposed to be out here. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared into some thick brush. Figured it was just a hunter who got lost or someone passing through. Still, it made me uneasy. I didn't carry a phone, but I had a flare gun in the cabin in case of emergencies. That night, I couldn't sleep as well. The air felt heavier, like it does before a storm. I kept thinking about those boot prints. The trees outside groaned in the wind, and I swear I heard something. Steps on dry leaves not far from the cabin, maybe around 200 feet. In the morning, I held my breath and sat up on the cot, holding the rifle across my lap. But nothing came. No knock on the door, no light movement, just quiet again. Day 3. I went back to the creek bed to check the trail cam. There wasn't much on it, just a few raccoons, but I noticed something else, a piece of dark fabric, like a torn sleeve hanging from a branch nearby. It wasn't there yesterday. It looked like denim, maybe from a jacket. I didn't touch it. I just backed away and went back to the cabin. I started to get this feeling in my gut, a wrongness, the kind you get when someone's watching you. I didn't want to be paranoid, but I also wasn't going to act like nothing was going on. That evening, I stayed inside. I didn't light the oil lamp, just kept my back against the wall and listened. I had the rifle on the table, safety off. Around 11 p.m., I heard something again, not just the wind. This time, it was clearer. Crunching leaves, slow steps. I leaned up and peered out through the tiny window. There was no moon, but I could just make out a shape by the edge of the tree line. Tall. Still. Too still. It didn't move for a long time. I didn't blink. I just watched. Eventually, it stepped backward and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the 4th day, I wanted to leave. My cooler was still mostly full, but I packed it up anyway and loaded the rifle with fresh rounds. I didn't want to walk back to the truck in the dark, so I figured I'd leave the next morning at first light. I spent that day cleaning up, securing the place, and sitting by the window with the rifle across my knees. That night was the worst. It started around midnight. I heard footsteps again, closer. I didn't move. Then I heard something drag across the outside of the cabin, maybe a stick or the edge of a coat. It circled the place once slowly, then nothing. I held my breath for what felt like hours. Then at some point near dawn, I dozed off. When I woke up, the sun was barely rising, the sky was gray. I stood, stretched, and stepped outside, half thinking I'd imagined the whole thing. Then I saw the footprints, deep ones right up to the door and around the back of the cabin. The prints weren't fresh. They were muddy, dried at the edges, like someone had been doing this more than once, watching, walking around, waiting. I packed everything in 10 minutes flat. I didn't clean the dishes. I didn't fold the cot. I just threw things in the cooler and shoved it into the truck bed. As I drove back down the gravel road, I caught something in the rearview mirror. A figure stepping just barely into view from the tree line, watching me go. Again, too still. I never looked back after that. When I got home, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just another hunter, maybe a drifter, someone living off-grid. Maybe it was all in my head, but then I remembered something that didn't sit right. A few weeks later, I got a letter from the county. It was about the property taxes, standard stuff, but it mentioned something I hadn't thought about. My uncle's property butted up against another parcel, a small one, maybe a few acres that had never been developed, no records, no address. It was just a black spot on the map. Out of curiosity, I drove down to the local clerk's office, asked to see the parcel data. They told me that land had been under dispute for years. No clear ownership, no sales, just listed under natural reserve, though no one had any clue who designated it that way. I never went back to the cabin. I never even sold it. It's probably still there, rotting in the woods, Whatever I saw or whatever was out there wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some supernatural thing. It was a person, flesh and blood, watching, waiting, maybe even living out there off the land, tracking people moving through the woods like an animal. And the worst part, I still wonder if it followed me back sometimes. On quiet nights, I look out the window and feel like something is standing just beyond the fence, behind the trees, where the porch light doesn't reach. I haven't hunted since. It was the fall of 2004. When I found myself heading out toward Carter's Ridge in northern Arkansas, I was 36 at the time, working maintenance for a small school district and in between relationships, living in a rental just outside Boonville. The days were cooling off, and for some reason, I had it in my head that I needed to get out into the woods for a while, get some quiet, some space to think. I wasn't a city guy, never had been. I grew up around Fort Smith, but had spent more time in the woods than anywhere else. Hunting, camping, sometimes just walking. I had a beat-up Ford Ranger, a good tent, and a few days off I hadn't used. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't really think it was necessary. That wasn't strange back then. Carter's Ridge wasn't on many maps. You could find it if you had one of those older USGS topographic prints, but even then it wasn't marked as anything special. Just hills, creeks, and a rough trail running through some national forest land. I'd only been out that way once years back, and I remembered there being a clearing near a bluff that overlooked a narrow valley. That's where I wanted to set up camp. I left just after sunrise on a Thursday. The drive took me a few hours, most of it on gravel roads. That hadn't been maintained in years. The last few miles were slow, full of washouts and ruts deep enough to swallow a tire. If I wasn't careful eventually, I parked the truck off a narrow cut in that looked like it had been used by hunters long ago. From there, it was all on foot. I had my old Alice pack, about 50 pounds worth of gear, enough food for 4 days, and a .22 rifle strapped to the side, not for any serious hunting, just squirrels or rabbits. If I needed something extra, I also brought a hatchet, a roll of paracord, and a small water filter in case I needed to drink from the creeks. I packed light and efficient. Years of doing this taught me that the first 2 miles of hiking went fast. I followed the old trail up and over a low ridge, then down into a shallow hollow where I could hear a creek running. Everything looked good. There was no sign of anyone having been out there in a long time. No wrappers, no recent boot prints, nothing. The woods were alive, but quiet, just the way I liked them. I crossed the creek at a shallow bend, took a moment to fill one of my canteens, then headed up the slope on the far side. That's when I saw it. About halfway up the slope, hidden behind some overgrown brush, was a structure. At first, I thought it might just be a hunting blind or maybe a shed, but as I got closer, it became clear that this was something older, something built back when people used to live way out here long before the forest took everything back. It was a cabin, old, slanted, half buried in leaf litter and vines. The roof sagged in the middle, and the chimney was crumbling. The wood was gray and dry, with moss creeping up one side and carpenter bees buzzing around the eaves. A rusted metal bucket lay tipped over near the front door, and there were the faint outlines of a small vegetable patch long reclaimed by weeds and thorns. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. There was something off about the place, but not in a dramatic way. It wasn't haunted or cursed or anything like that. It just felt forgotten in a way that made me uneasy, like I was the first person to lay eyes on it in decades. Something about the cabin didn't sit right with me, but I was curious. I always had been. I walked around it slowly, checking for signs of animals or recent activity. The windows, just small cutouts with shutters, were sealed shut with weathered boards. The door looked warped and didn't have a handle, just an old iron latch. I gave it a light push and it creaked open an inch. That was enough. The air that came out was thick with mold and rot, and the smell of old wood soaked through with decades of moisture. I didn't go in, not right away. Instead, I decided to set up camp near the bluff I'd originally planned on. I figured I'd come back later to check the place out more thoroughly. I didn't want to waste daylight, and besides, I wasn't in any rush to spend time inside that place. I hiked the rest of the way up and found the bluff without much trouble. It was just how I remembered it. A wide clearing, a flat spot for the tent, and a view that dropped off into a quiet valley. I set up camp, got a small fire going, and made dinner. As the sun dropped behind the hills, the woods got colder and the wind picked up. I could hear it moving through the trees in long, slow breaths, but beneath the wind, I thought I could hear something else. It was faint, almost buried under the sound of the leaves, but it was there. Something like a soft scraping or shuffling far off in the direction of the cabin. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or raccoon, maybe something rooting through the brush. Still, I found myself turning toward the cabin more than once during the night, listening. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, after a quick breakfast and some coffee from my old steel percolator, I grabbed the rifle and headed back toward the cabin. The light was better now, and I could see more clearly how it had been built. Whoever put it up knew what they were doing. It wasn't just a thrown-together shelter. The corners were dovetailed. The foundation was made of large, flat stones, and there was even the remains of a rain barrel system inside. The floor was mostly intact, though some of the boards were soft and spongy. There was a table in the center, a few shelves, and what looked like the remains of a bed frame against the far wall. An old stove sat crooked in the corner. It was long, rusted through. Everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, and I could see where rodents had made nests in the corners. But what caught my eye was the trapdoor. It was in the back corner, half hidden under a pile of broken planks. I cleared it off slowly, listening for any sign of movement beneath. The door was small, about 2 feet by 2 feet, and had a rusted iron ring set into the wood. I pulled on it, and after some effort, the hatch creaked open. A narrow set of stairs led down into darkness. I stood there for a long time staring into that black hole in the floor. The air coming out was colder than I expected. I didn't have a flashlight with me, just a small headlamp, but I put it on and started down slowly, one step at a time. The basement or cellar, I guess, isn't something I can describe easily. It wasn't a root cellar like I expected. It was bigger, dug deep into the hillside, reinforced with timber and stone. The walls were damp, and the dirt floor was uneven. There were old shelves down there stacked with broken jars and rusted cans. In one corner, there was a pile of rotted blankets, and next to it, what looked like a pile of bones, animal bones. I told myself that more than once, but they were too clean, too organized. I backed out slowly, climbed up into the cabin, and closed the hatch. I wasn't scared exactly, but I didn't want to spend any more time down there. I told myself I just stumbled onto an old hunting camp, maybe used during the Depression, maybe by someone who lived off-grid. Still, I kept thinking about those bones, the way they were stacked, almost like someone had placed them there with care. Back at camp, I packed up my things. I didn't want to stay the full 4 days anymore. Something about the place just didn't feel right. I don't know how else to put it. The cabin, the cellar, the bones, they all made the woods feel heavier. Somehow, I hiked back to the truck before nightfall, keeping my rifle close. I didn't see or hear anything unusual on the way out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It's easy to get paranoid in the woods, especially when you're alone. Every branch snap or rustle becomes something sinister. When I got back to the truck, I found something that stopped me cold. There were prints in the dirt beside the passenger door, bare footprints, human. The toes, the heel, the arch, all there. They weren't mine. I'd been wearing boots. They weren't old either. The edges were sharp. the dirt freshly disturbed. I didn't wait around to find out who or what made them. I drove out fast, tearing down that old gravel road with dust flying behind me. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I never went back to Carter's Ridge. I told myself over the years that it was probably just a squatter, maybe someone living off the grid, same as the folks who used that cabin long ago. Maybe they came back while I was exploring, saw my truck, and left, pristine, without meaning any harm. But I think about that trapdoor a lot, about how the stairs went deeper than they should have, about those bones, too many for one animal, too clean, too carefully arranged. Sometimes late at night, I still see that print in the dirt, that perfect barefoot impression next to my truck out in the middle of nowhere, and I wonder if I walked into something I wasn't meant to see. My name is Mark, and I was 34 when it happened. This was back in late October of 2016. I had just gone through a bad divorce and needed to get away from everything. I wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone, answer calls, or even sit in a bar pretending I was okay. I had some vacation time saved up, and I told my boss I was going to be unreachable for a couple of weeks. He didn't ask questions. I packed up and drove to a cabin my uncle used to own out in northern Michigan, not far from Huron National Forest. He passed away a few years earlier, and no one else in the family really used the place. I hadn't been there since I was a teenager. The drive was long, almost 8 hours, but it felt good just to be alone. With my thoughts, I had a few podcasts downloaded and a couple of sandwiches wrapped up in foil on the passenger seat. I remember the highway gradually giving way to smaller roads, then gravel, then finally a narrow dirt path that I had to take real slow to avoid bottoming out. The forest around was deep and quiet. By the time I got to the cabin, the sun was low. In the sky, the whole place looked like it had been dipped in orange. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, one level with green metal siding and roof, no Wi-Fi. I didn't mind. That was the point. Just a mattress, wood stove, some old furniture. There was an outhouse, maybe 50 feet out back, and a small hand pump well next to the porch that groaned when I used it. No neighbors. The nearest house I passed on the way in had to be at least 2 miles back. I unloaded what I needed, mostly dry food, some firewood, a couple of 5-gallon jugs of water, a small radio, and an old .38 revolver my dad gave me after the divorce. I wasn't planning on using it, but it made me feel better to have it. The place smelled like dust and wood, and the air was colder inside than it was outside. I got a fire going in the stove and rolled out my sleeping bag on top of the mattress. I cracked a beer and sat on the porch as the last of the light faded from the trees. The first night was quiet, and I slept surprisingly well. No phone buzzing, no sounds of traffic, no emails to check, just the creak of the trees and the occasional crackle of the fire. I woke up early, made some instant coffee, and went for a walk down a trail I half remembered from my teenage years. It looped around a small creek and came back behind the cabin. After maybe 1.5 miles, leaves crunched underfoot. I saw deer tracks and once heard something big crash through the brush, but I never saw what it was. When I got back, I chopped some more wood and sat by the fire for a while. I had a notebook with me, but I didn't write much. I just stared at the flames. I think I was trying not to think, if that makes sense. I did that for 2 days. Hiked, sat, slept, repeated. Felt like I was slowly wringing all the tension out of my body. But on the third night, something woke me up. I couldn't tell what at first. I remember lying there in the dark, heart going a little faster than usual, listening hard. I thought maybe it had just been a dream, or maybe a squirrel on the roof. But then I heard it again. A dull thudding noise. Not loud, but heavy, like something knocking against wood. It wasn't near the door. It sounded like it was under the cabin. I sat up listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a porcupine or something, maybe a possum. Under there, it's not like the place was airtight. I tried to go back to sleep, but I kept hearing little noises, scraping, shuffling. Once I thought I heard a low cough, but that didn't make sense. I stayed still until the sun came up, and then I went outside to look. The cabin was raised off the ground on cement blocks, just high enough for someone to maybe crawl under. I peered underneath, but it was too dark to see anything. There were old boards, maybe some insulation, some dead leaves blown in by the wind. I didn't see any tracks or droppings. I figured whatever it was had moved on. Still, it sat weird with me that day. I walked farther down the gravel road to the old fire tower, then looped around to an old logging trail. When I got back, I checked under the cabin again, but nothing. That night, I drank a little more than usual and kept the revolver close by the bed. I fell asleep eventually around 3. In the morning, I woke up again. Same sound thing, this time rhythmic, like someone knocking softly from underneath the floorboards. It moved from under the kitchen area, then toward the bedroom. My eyes were wide open and I wasn't breathing. I could feel the thuds through the mattress, faint vibrations, then silence. I got up and turned on the lantern. Everything looked normal. I didn't want to go outside. I just sat in the chair until dawn with the gun in my lap, listening. Nothing else happened that night. The next day, I walked into the woods behind the cabin, checking the ground for signs of anyone. I didn't know what I was looking for. A part of me was still trying to convince myself it was just an animal, but there were no prints, no disturbed dirt, just dry leaves and old tree stumps. I circled around the cabin twice. I even laid flat on the ground and looked under with a flashlight. That's when I saw it. A small pile of fabric tucked way in the back near one of the support beams. It looked like a rolled-up shirt or blanket, dirty and crumpled. Next to it, a small tin can. I couldn't make out what was inside. I didn't crawl under to check. I didn't want to. I stood up and stared at the cabin for a long time. Someone had been sleeping under there. I packed a small bag with essentials and hiked about 2 miles out to where I remembered getting 1 bar of reception on the way in. I called the local sheriff's office, told them what I found, and waited on the road. It took them over an hour to get there. I walked them back in and pointed to the cabin. They found more than I expected. Not just the blanket and tin can, but a whole little setup. A tarp tacked to the beams to keep out rain, a stash of canned food, some of which I recognized from my own supplies, empty water bottles, a pocket knife, a small flashlight, even a few torn pages from my notebook. They told me whoever it was had probably been living under there before I arrived, and maybe stayed while I was. They said it wasn't uncommon for squatters to use remote cabins. What scared me most wasn't just that someone had been down there, but that they hadn't tried to hurt me, hadn't broken in, hadn't even left signs of being. They just stayed underneath, listening, watching. They never found him. The officers searched the woods and took photos, but the guy was long gone. They didn't seem too alarmed, just another drifter, they said, probably moved on. I stayed 1 more night. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't want to leave feeling like I was running. I kept every light on and didn't sleep. Nothing happened in the morning. I locked the door behind me, got in the truck, and drove until I hit pavement. I never went back to that cabin. I sold it a year later. The scariest part wasn't the noises. It wasn't even finding the stuff under the house. It was the thought that for at least 2 days, maybe longer, I was sleeping just a few feet above someone who never made a sound. Someone who chose not to show himself. Someone who knew I was there, knew I was alone, and still stayed silent in the dirt beneath me. I think about it sometimes. When I can't sleep, I wonder what he looked like. I wonder if he ever watched me through the floorboards or through the cracks in the foundation. I wonder if he was sick. I wonder how long he stayed after I left. I don't go into the woods alone anymore, and I sleep a lot lighter now. I'm not the kind of person who believes in anything spooky. No ghosts, no legends, no stories passed down in hushed voices over bonfires. I've always believed that if something scares you, it's probably just because you don't understand it. At least that's what I thought until the winter of 2019. When I spent 3 days alone at a remote cabin in North Yorkshire, I was 34. Then, my name's Luke Walker. I work in engineering, mostly surveying land for wind turbines, laying out future infrastructure projects, and doing some contract-based mapping jobs. It's not as glamorous as it sounds, but it pays well and occasionally gives me the chance to get out of the city. That's what I needed back then, a break. Work had been piling up. My head was full of spreadsheets, diagrams, and emails. I hadn't taken proper time off in almost 2 years, so I booked a small timber cabin through a listing I found on a quiet holiday rental site. The place looked basic. No Wi-Fi, no TV, just a wood-burning stove, a bed, a kitchen, and quiet woods all around it. It was near a village called Bransby, not far from the Howardian Hills, which I'd never visited before. That was the appeal. Total peace and quiet. I arrived on a Monday morning in mid-January, cold gray, typical English weather. My van rattled down the narrow country lane that curved through hedgerows and dipped through patches of forest. I passed a single farmhouse about 10 minutes before reaching the end of the lane, where a small wooden gate stood slightly ajar. Beyond it was a dirt track, muddy from the rain, with 2 deep tire grooves leading through a break in the trees. The cabin sat about 100 yards into the woods, just far enough in that you couldn't see it from the road. The track wasn't well kept. I had to slow almost to a crawl as branches brushed the side of my van. Moss covered the base of the trees, and I saw no lights, no signs, nothing man-made except the track itself. That isolation felt exciting. At first, it felt like I was leaving the world behind. The cabin was smaller than I expected. A simple A-frame, probably built in the 80s or earlier, made from weathered pine planks that had turned a kind of dull gray. The front door was painted red, chipped, and faded. A small porch sagged slightly on one side, clearly leaning into the soft soil. The key had been left under a stone near the steps, just like the owner had told me in the confirmation email. When I opened the door, the smell of damp wood and old smoke hit me. It wasn't unpleasant, just old, real, like something time had passed by inside. There was a single main room with a wood-burning stove, a small sofa, and a narrow bed pushed up against the far wall. A kitchenette ran along one side with a sink and 2 cupboards. A kettle sat on the hob. The bathroom was tiny. Just a toilet and a shower stall, with a curtain that clung to your legs. The windows were small, with thick wooden frames, and one of them looked out toward the forest. I noticed straight away that the glass on that one had a strange fogged patch on the bottom corner, like a thumb had smeared condensation from the inside. I unpacked slowly. Just one rucksack, a crate with some food, and a bag of logs I'd bought at a petrol station. I didn't need much. I was planning to read, maybe go for some walks, sleep, and clear my head. The stove took a while to get going, but by sunset the room was warm. I sat on the couch with a book and watched the light die outside. The silence was total. No hum of distant roads, no sirens, just wind through the trees and the occasional groan of the old cabin as it settled. That first night passed without anything strange happening. I slept early. The mattress was thin, but I didn't care. The cold crept in sometime around 3 a.m, and I had to get up to throw another log into the stove, but otherwise, it was exactly what I wanted. It was. The second day, things started to feel off. I woke up just after 8 a.m., made coffee, and decided to explore the woods behind the cabin. There were no marked trails, but I'd brought my boots and coat, so I didn't mind pushing through the undergrowth. The forest was dense in places, but thinned out the further I walked. I followed a ridge that sloped downward for a while and found an old dry stone wall, crumbled and covered in ivy. Beyond that was a field, empty and fenced, and I saw the outline of a barn about a quarter-mile away. I figured it must be part of a nearby farm. I spent most of the day wandering, then came back to the cabin around 3 p.m. to warm up and make lunch. As I came back up the track, I noticed something that made me stop. There were boot prints in the mud, not mine. At first I thought maybe they were old, just left by someone else before me, but they were fresh, still sharp around the edges. The tread pattern was different from my own, narrower. The heel was worn down more, and they led from the track right up to the side of the cabin. They didn't come from the direction of the gate. Whoever made them had walked from deeper in the forest. I followed them. They circled the cabin once, passed beneath the living room window, and then turned sharply into the trees again, heading off into the thicker brush where there was no path. I stopped when the prints became harder to follow. The moss covered much of the ground, and the light was fading. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the woods, my breath visible in the cold air. The trees were still, no birds, no wind. Back inside, I locked the door. I checked every window. All were shut. Nothing inside had been moved. Still, I'd kept glancing at the front window for the rest of the afternoon. That strange fogged smear on the corner of the glass caught the light in a way that made it look almost like a fingerprint. I wiped it with my sleeve. It didn't go away. The glass wasn't dirty. It was warped. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Around midnight, I heard something. A faint crunching outside, not constant. Just a single sound like someone stepping on twigs. I sat up in bed, heart beating harder than it should have. The stove was nearly out. The room was cold again. I waited in silence, listening, nothing. I got up and walked to the front window. I didn't turn on the lights, just stood there in the dark and looked out. The forest was black. I couldn't see beyond the porch. I was about to turn away when I saw her, a woman standing just beyond the edge of the porch near the first tree, still as stone, wearing a long coat buttoned high at the neck. Her face was pale, but I couldn't see the details. The shadows hid her eyes. Her hair looked wet or matted. She wasn't moving. I didn't move either. I just stood there staring. She didn't speak, didn't gesture, didn't step forward. She just stood there like she had been watching me for longer than I realized. Then, slowly, she stepped backward into the darkness and disappeared into the trees. I stayed at that window for over an hour. Nothing returned. No sound, no movement. The next morning, I left the cabin for a while and drove into the village to clear my head. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I told myself, maybe it was a hiker, someone lost, but she hadn't looked lost. She looked like she was exactly where she wanted to be. Back at the cabin later that day, I checked the ground outside. More prints, the same ones from yesterday, and something else. A few broken branches beneath the tree where she'd stood that night. I slept with a knife beside the bed. I didn't light the stove. I didn't want the smoke giving away that I was still there. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Deliberate, slow, the wood creaked beneath. Wait, then silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I waited, staring up at the ceiling. I imagined the red door opening. I imagined her walking in, but it didn't happen. Eventually, morning came. I stepped outside. As the sun broke through the trees, frost covered the ground. On the porch were more prints, standing, waiting, facing the door, but she hadn't knocked, hadn't tried to come in. She didn't want to come inside. She wanted me to come outside. I packed up my things without eating breakfast. I took photos of the prints with my phone. I didn't call the police. I didn't have anything to tell them that didn't sound mad. A woman stood outside my cabin and stared at me. That was it. I left the key under the stone and drove back down the track. I didn't look in the mirror for weeks after. I kept checking the back of my van, expecting to see her face there. I never did. Nothing ever followed me, but I never went back to that part of Yorkshire again. I told myself maybe she was just someone living rough, mentally ill, off the grid, but she didn't look disoriented or scared. She looked calm, like she had a reason to be there. I didn't write a review for the cabin. I didn't want anyone else asking about it. I don't know who she was. Maybe someone who used to live there. Maybe someone hiding from something or someone. But I know one thing for sure. She didn't want to hurt me. If she did, she had every chance. She just wanted me to know she was there, and for 3 nights I did. I was 31 when I decided to take some time off and spend a few weeks alone in a remote part of New Mexico. It was early fall 2014. My job back then was heavy with deadlines, meetings, and just the kind of soul-sucking routine. That makes you forget you're a person. I was writing software full-time, doing contracts for small businesses out of my apartment in El Paso, paid well, but I felt boxed in. I needed space, something different. A friend of mine from high school, Thomas, had a grandfather who passed away the year before and left behind a hunting cabin up in the Gila National Forest. His family didn't want it. It was remote, about 40 minutes from the nearest road, and it had no electricity, plumbing, or cell signal. When I asked Thomas if I could borrow the place for a few weeks, he barely even paused. He said, sure, gave me directions, and told me the keys were hidden under a flat rock near the porch. I left the second weekend of October. I packed all the things I thought I might need: non-perishable food, water containers, propane stove, basic tools, a rifle, and a secondhand solar battery kit, with a few power banks to charge my laptop and phone, even though I knew they wouldn't get a signal. I figured I could use them to watch movies or write if I got bored. I also brought a few books, a journal, and a small solar lantern. It took most of a day to drive up into the forest and then hike the rest of the way to the cabin. The truck couldn't make it all the way there. I had to leave it in a dirt pullout and hump my gear up a narrow path that twisted through the trees. The sun was dipping low. By the time I found the cabin, it was a squat one-room structure made of aging pine logs with a sagging tin roof and a small covered porch. It had a padlock on the front door and a few nails driven into the beams where old tools still hung: axes, a rusty saw, an animal trap that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I found the key under the rock, like Thomas said. Inside, the place was simple but dry and clean. There was a cot in one corner with a musty sleeping bag, a wood stove, a chipped table, and 2 chairs. No lights, of course. The windows were small, dirty, and set high in the walls with thick shutters that bolted from the inside. A small cabinet held a few old cans of food, a kettle, and some plates. Everything smelled of old wood and dust. It felt right, quiet, just what I needed. The first couple of days passed peacefully. I explored the trails around the area, collected firewood, and adjusted to the silence. It's a strange thing being alone in a place with no clocks, no traffic, no buzz of electricity in the walls. You start hearing things you forgot existed: wind in the leaves, the crunch of squirrels in the brush, the way pine trees grow when they shift at night. I'd sit on the porch and listen to the forest. Coyotes howled in the distance. Owls called to each other once or twice. I thought I heard something larger, maybe a deer or an elk moving through the trees, but nothing ever came close. It was peaceful until it wasn't. It started with tracks. On the 5th morning, I stepped out to relieve myself behind the cabin and saw something in the dirt. Prints. They weren't boot tracks, not hooves either. They looked human, barefoot, but too large and spaced too far apart. They came from the trees, passed near the porch, and then disappeared off the trail. I crouched down and studied them. 5 toes, long arch, deep heel, definitely barefoot. I thought maybe someone else was up there, a hiker, a hermit maybe, but the prints were strange. The toes were too long and the gait was off, too wide, almost like a loping stride. I brushed it off. Maybe I just hadn't seen them clearly. Maybe it was a bear and I was imagining the shape. I went about my day, but I started to feel uneasy. I didn't go far from the cabin that day. I kept the rifle close that night. I didn't sleep much. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside. A soft thump, then another, then silence. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I didn't move. I listened. There it was again, scratching, light like claws on wood. Then footsteps, slow, dragging steps along the porch. I stayed still for maybe 15 minutes, clutching the rifle and staring at the door. I didn't hear the steps leave, just silence. After a while, eventually, I must have fallen asleep because I woke to daylight seeping through the shutters. I went outside and looked around. The ground was disturbed in front of the porch. Same tracks, bare feet, long toes, wide gate. I followed them for a bit. They circled the cabin once, twice. Then they led off into the trees. Again, I stayed close to the fire that night. I locked the door, bolted the shutters, and kept the rifle loaded and nearby. I didn't hear anything until just before dawn. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate, then quiet. I didn't move. The sun came up like nothing happened. I looked at the door and saw fresh scratches near the bottom, like someone had dragged their nails across the wood. By the 9th day, I was sleeping in short bursts. I barely left the cabin. I cooked inside, kept the fire small, tried not to make noise. Every night, it came closer. I never saw it, only heard it. And every morning there were more tracks. Sometimes the prints were joined by strange marks, like someone had knelt down or crawled in the dirt. Once I found a clump of dark hair snagged on a nail by the porch. It wasn't animal fur. It looked like human hair, but thicker, wirier. Then came the worst night. I'd stayed up late reading with the lantern low. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard something scraping on the roof, not walking, sliding. It moved from one end to the other, then it stopped above me. I held my breath. I could hear breathing, deep, heavy, slow. Something was up lying flat on the tin roof, breathing through the cracks. I didn't move for an hour. The sun came up and the breathing stopped. I went outside, circled the cabin, and climbed up the side using a log pile. The tin was scratched, bent in some places, and there at the edge were prints, handprints, long fingers almost twice as long as mine with nails. I made up my mind to leave that day. I packed everything I could carry and left the rest. I started down the trail fast, rifle slung over my shoulder, gear on my back, but something followed me. I didn't see it, but I heard it stalking through the brush, matching my pace. Whenever I stopped, it stopped. I yelled once, just out of frustration, even though I promised myself I wouldn't. The woods answered with silence. The worst part wasn't hearing it. It was knowing that it wanted me to know it was playing with me. By the time I reached the truck, I was soaked in sweat and shaking. I threw the gear in the bed, slammed the door, and took off down the dirt road, gravel flying behind me. I didn't look in the rear view. I didn't sleep much that night either. Back in my apartment, I kept the blinds shut. I triple-locked the door. I even pulled my mattress into the hallway just to avoid the windows. A few days later, I talked to Thomas again. I didn't tell him everything, just asked him if anyone else used the cabin recently. He said no. In fact, his family hadn't been up there in years. He mentioned something else too, offhand. His grandfather had stopped using the cabin suddenly back in the 90s. Said the old man claimed someone was coming around at night. They thought it was just paranoia. Ha! I never went back to that cabin. I still have dreams about it, though not nightmares, just memories. But there's always something added in the dreams. Shapes between the trees, breathing at the window, long fingers curling around the doorframe. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know that whatever was up there, it wasn't some hermit or a bear or a prank. It watched me. It knew when I was sleeping. It knew when I was awake. It circled the cabin, scraped the walls, breathed on the roof, and it never once showed its face because it didn't need to. And that's what scared me the most. It wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to make me leave. And it worked. I still keep a rifle in my bedroom closet. I still flinch when I hear footsteps outside at night, and when someone asks me about the scariest thing I've ever experienced, I don't give them the full story because even I have trouble believing it. But every so often, when I wake up in the middle of the night and the world is dead quiet, I swear I hear it again. Soft footsteps, long and dragging, just outside my door, and I wonder if it ever really stayed in those woods or if I brought it back with me.